Imagine you are a young lady in a world long before ours. In the hush of early morning, you rise to wash, comb your hair, and greet the day with grace. Or perhaps you're in the warm glow of an evening fire, the steady rhythm of your needle stitching patience into every seam. These were not just tasks, they were the very language of ladyhood, treasured in homes from the Nile's golden banks to the bustling streets of Babylon. Tonight we open the Lady's Book of Ancient Wisdom, where every page holds a story to soothe the mind, warm the heart, and carry you into gentle dreams. Be diligent in combing your hair and washing your body, and pursue cleanness and tidiness in general. The sun had not yet risen over the city of Thebes, but the air already carried the faint scent of the river, cool, silvery, and deep. Nephura opened her eyes to the faint glow of the oil lamp in her small chamber, its wick burning low. She lay still for a moment, listening. Somewhere beyond the walls of the palace, an ibis cried, and far off the splash of oars reached her ears. Today, like every day, she would serve in the household of Queen Henut, wife of Pharaoh. But Nephura had learned something in her short time here. In the palace, appearances mattered almost as much as the work one did. The queen noticed everything, not just the cleanliness of her chambers, but the posture of the servants, the smoothness of their hair, the way they carried themselves through the halls. Nephura rose quietly and unrolled the reed mat that served as her floor covering. She took the clay jar from its place in the corner and poured water into the wide washing bowl. The water was cool against her skin as she rinsed her face, her arms, her hands. She rubbed her skin gently with a small piece of natron soap, breathing in its faint mineral scent. Then she reached for the wooden comb her mother had given her before she left for Thebes. As she drew the comb through her black hair, she remembered her mother's words, thoughtful. To be clean is to show respect, to the gods, to others, and to yourself. Never let the dust of the road or the weariness of the day make you careless. The queen's servants were not given the finest oils, but Nephura had managed to trade a small bundle of figs for a vial of blue lotus oil. She dabbed a drop at her temples, letting the rich, floral aroma mingle with the morning air. Once she had dressed in her simple but spotless linen tunic, she turned to her chamber. The bedroll was smoothed flat, her sandals placed neatly side by side, the small amulet of Hathor on the wall wiped free of dust. Even here, in the smallest corners of the palace, there was no excuse for disorder. By mid-morning, the air was already warm, and the palace hummed with preparations. Nephura carried a tray of fresh bread through the colonnade, careful not to spill a single crumb. The scent of honey and coriander clung to the loaves, and from somewhere nearby came the faint trill of a flute, mingling with the rhythmic thud of pestles grinding herbs. Servants hurried past in every direction, one balancing a basket of figs, another carrying folded linen robes for the queen's handmaidens. Beyond the pillared walkway, the great courtyard shimmered in the sunlight, its flagstones hot enough to make bare feet dance. As Nephura stepped into the open space, she paused for a breath, tilting her face toward the brightness. But in that instant, she noticed something strange. The sharp blue of the morning sky was fading, as if brushed over by a dusty veil. The wind shifted. First a whisper, tugging at the edges of her robe, then a sigh that rattled the palm fronds overhead. She tightened her grip on the tray and quickened her pace. A low murmur spread among the servants. Some shaded their eyes, looking toward the desert beyond the palace walls. Nephura followed their gaze, and her breath caught. On the horizon, a wall of copper-colored haze was rising, thick and solid as if the land itself had been torn up and hurled toward them. The first sting of grit brushed her cheek. "Sandstorm!" someone shouted. Chaos bloomed instantly. A scribe dropped his scrolls, their careful ink smudging as they tumbled across the stones. The fig basket tipped, fruit rolling underfoot. A garland maker cried out as her flowers scattered into the wind. Nephura ducked her head and ran, the bread tray clutched to her chest. The air grew heavier, grittier, until her eyes watered. In the courtyard, guards struggled to push the heavy bronze gates shut, their voices muffled by the roar of the wind. But the storm was quicker. The first great gust swept into the palace, flinging sand through the colonnade like a spray of needles. By the time she reached the queen's chambers, her robe was dusted in ochre and her hair tangled. The room itself was dim, the light choked by the swirling haze outside. Queen Hanut sat by the window, her expression calm but her eyes sharp as she assessed the damage. "We go before the people in an hour," she said evenly. "We cannot appear as beggars covered in sand." Around her, the other attendants looked defeated. Sand clung to their robes, streaked their faces, and dulled the shine of every ornament. A golden mirror lay on the floor, its surface clouded. Nephura hesitated only a moment before setting down the bread. She found the washing basin in the corner, still half full from the morning. She fetched the last jar of clean water from the storeroom and poured it carefully. Then she knelt before the queen, rinsed a linen cloth, and began wiping the dust from her face with slow, deliberate strokes. Her hands moved without pause, combing the queen's hair strand by strand, brushing sand from the fine folds of her robe. The other attendants watching her work seemed to stir from their despair. They began to copy her motions, shaking out garments, polishing jewelry, smoothing the floor coverings. Outside, the wind still moaned through the high windows, but inside the queen's chamber, order was returning. By the time the storm's howl faded, the room smelled faintly of lotus oil instead of grit. The queen rose, radiant once more, and her household followed her into the festival square as if the desert itself had bowed aside to let them pass. The festival square still bore traces of the storm. Sand lay in pale drifts at the base of statues, and the bright pennants that had once streamed overhead now hung heavy and still. Yet, when the queen stepped into the open, the crowd gasped, not at the wreckage but at her. She shone like the morning star. Not a fleck of grit marred her face, not a thread of her linen robe was out of place. The gold at her wrist caught the sunlight, scattering it like sparks across the assembly. A laka murmur spread through the people, and soon the murmur became cheers. To them, her immaculate appearance meant one thing, that she was untouched by the chaos of the desert, favored by the gods themselves. Nephura kept to the side of the procession, clutching the empty water jar she had used. She watched as the queen greeted the temple priests, offered the bread she had carried through the storm, and raised her voice in blessing. Only once did the queen glance toward her, but it was enough. Her eyes softened for a moment, and a subtle tilt of her head conveyed what no public words could say. When the ceremony ended, the crowd dispersed slowly, reluctant to let the queen's presence fade. The high steward approached Nephura and pressed a small bundle into her hands. Inside was a comb of ivory, polished smooth, and a vial of fragrant myrrh oil. "Her Majesty says," the steward murmured, "that those who keep order in the storm are the ones who deserve the gifts of peace." That night, as the palace settled into quiet, Nephura placed the ivory comb on her low table. The myrrh's scent drifted through her small room, warm and comforting. She thought of the sandstorm's roar, of the grit stinging her eyes, and of the queen's shining face in the square, and she smiled. Learn needlework and do not be lazy. In the city of Babylon, where the river carried both wealth and whispers, lived a merchant named Bel-Shumar. His ships brought him spices from the east, copper from the mountains, and rare purple dye from far-off Tyre. His home stood at the end of a quiet street, with tall wooden doors painted deep red, and within its courtyard, the scent of figs and dates hung heavy in the warm air. Bel-Shumar had one daughter, Samira. She was fair and bright-eyed, and her father loved her dearly. Yet, for all her charm, she had a habit her mother frowned upon. She avoided the work of her hands. The household women spun thread, wove cloth, and stitched garments, but Samira would slip away to the roof to watch the riverboats glide past, her thoughts adrift like the sails in the wind. One afternoon, word arrived that the king himself would pass through the merchant's quarter in 3 days' time. Bel-Shumar's household prepared as though for a feast. Servants polished bronze bowls until they shone like the sun. Musicians were hired. And Samira's mother laid out her daughter's finest robe, dyed in the precious Tyrian purple her father had traded for with half a year's profit. But when her mother unfolded it, she gasped. The hem was torn, the threads loose as if gnawed by time itself. The robe had been stored poorly, left to catch on a splinter of the cedar chest. "Samira," her mother said, her voice low but sharp, "this must be mended. No servant's hands will do for such a robe. You must stitch it yourself, for the eyes of Babylon will be upon you." Samira's stomach sank. She had never finished a piece of needlework without making the stitches crooked or leaving the thread too tight. But her mother placed the robe and a basket of silk thread in her lap and left her in the courtyard. The hours stretched long. Samira pricked her fingers more than once. She thought of leaving the work to someone else, but her mother's words echoed in her mind. So she worked slowly, knot by knot, smoothing each stitch, undoing the ones that looked wrong, and starting again. By nightfall, her hands ached, and the moon was high. She held the hem up to the lamplight. It was not perfect, but the silk caught the glow, each stitch neat enough to pass a mother's inspection. The day of the king's procession arrived. The streets were a river of people, their voices 1,000 ripples. Samira stood beside her father at the gate, the purple robe falling in perfect folds. As the king's chariot passed, he looked their way, and for the briefest moment, his gaze lingered, not on the gold of her father's signet ring, nor the fine silver cups on display, but on the young woman in the purple robe with the proud, unflinching posture. That evening, after the last guest had gone and the house was quiet again, Bel-Shumar came to Samira's room. In his hand, he held a small cedar box. Inside lay a pair of golden needles, their eyes smooth and shining. "For the girl," he said, "who mended more than a robe today." Samira smiled, running her fingers over the needles. She understood now, needlework was not just cloth and thread, but patience, care, and the quiet pride of creating something worth wearing before kings. And that night, she dreamed not of idle riverboats, but of fabrics she had yet to sew, robes yet to stitch, and the gentle sound of her golden needles passing through silk. And so, in both Egypt and Babylon, wisdom found its way into daily life, whether through a comb and a wash basin, or a needle and a spool of silk. If you enjoyed these gentle journeys into the past, I invite you to stay with me for more stories like this. You can subscribe so the next time the ancient world has something to share, you'll be here to listen. Until then, sleep well, dream kindly, and carry a little bit of that old world wisdom into your tomorrow.